Like when I say I'm Korean and randomly people will be like, oh, I love K-pop. And I'm like, oh, that's different. You know, it used to be like, oh, I love kimchi. And now it's like something else that has a little more depth than just like something you'll eat. I wonder if just people watching this are learning like, oh yeah, okay, maybe not all Asians look alike, even though they're all Korean. Like what is valuable? Like what is life, right? Like what do we value in our life? Is it really just money? Are we just here to work and die? I find that in dating, because you're trying to be intimate with somebody, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally, that it brings out a lot of the concerns of not being monoracial. And so for people who maybe haven't explored that part of their identity, I do think it might come out and be something that they are confronted with when they are dating a monoracial person.
Ginger, thanks for coming on to the show. You are a biracial Korean-Swedish educator with a PhD in sociology who's taught at the elementary and college level. You are also the host of Sippin Tea with Dr. G, a podcast with insightful conversations on relationships, identity, and society. I'm super excited to have you on today because we're going to have a really eclectic mix of topics to discuss, ranging from K-pop and capitalism to veganism and biracial identity. And to kick off our discussion, I want to rewind the clock to your upbringing and childhood, back to a time when it wasn't cool to be Asian, back to a time when, positive Asian representation in media was basically a pipe dream.
Yeah.
There wasn't a Crazy Rich Asians, there wasn't, talk of a Cowboy Bebop remake or BTS, and, hardly any instance of truly positive and healthy Asian representation from our perspectives. So when you look back at the last 30 years, 20 years of horribly racist media or non-existent media representation for Asian people, how do you describe your relationship with your own Asian identity at that time when this sort of, Wild West of no Asian representation was going on?
Oh my gosh. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be on Love Life of an Asian Guy. So yeah, that's a great question. I grew up as a biracial, as you said, Korean-Swedish person in a very white town with my white dad, and my Asian mother was very much absent from the picture in my formative years. So there was a lot of trying to be white and trying to pass as much as possible, which was pretty successful. You can see my face, but also it's emblematic of how it is in the United States now. It's like you're passing until you're not. Mm-hmm. And it's like, oh yeah, but we can still out of nowhere just tell you that you're not white or that you don't belong, and to the convenience of the bullies or oppressor, whatever level you want to think about it. So yeah, I didn't see myself really in any kind of media. My dad didn't know how to be supportive, and it was just me and him when I was growing up. So I don't know if you have experiences like this too, but my dad would literally point out every Asian person on TV. Literally, it would be like, hey, Ginge, Asians. And I'm like, cool. Like, I don't know what to do with this information. I'm not even trying to be Asian. So like Connie Chung, when she was on the news, like he would point that out. And like, it was funny growing up. And like, that was like his way of trying to be supportive of like my interracial identity and my biracialness. So yeah, I feel like I'm trying to think of a time when I did feel like there was some kind of representation. And I guess the Joy Luck Club came out when I was maybe in middle school, high schoolish, and that I was not ready. Like I was still in a very rebellious, I'm trying to be white. I have a very fraught relationship with my mom, and because she made me look like this, and then she abruptly left me for a very long time. And so it was really hard for me to like feel connected or want to be connected, but at the same time everybody would constantly point out how I look different and like, why do you look like that kind of thing, what are you, all those kinds of questions. So yeah, I find like now this is a much healthier era to like turn to Asians in media and their representation, but there's still a lot of criticism and like concerns I have, which is what I'm excited to talk about. Yeah. What about you? How was your upbringing with and your relationship with media representation?
For me, it was like, I grew up with a older brother who was very typical like toxic male type of,
Right.
football, just trying to be the most aggro dude in the room kind of a thing. And so I think having an older brother like that really, um, I think reinforced as I've learned, you know, uh, getting older, that it reinforced how I felt about um, the poor representation of Asian Americans, because even the cases where Asian representation was like kind of there in like certain martial arts or whatnot, my brother was the type of person who was like, no, that's like, you know, those people are fobs. Those people are, they're backwards. They're not the cool Asians. And so I always just had a really negative outlook on um, the different type of media that was going on. And I also just didn't see myself represented in any like kids shows or anything like that. Um, and so I was always looking for that type of representation. And unfortunately, I always just ended up finding that in like white, related movies and TV shows. And I think that that had that impact of making me feel like, you know, that the hero couldn't be Asian, that the good person couldn't be Asian, that that if you're Asian and smart, that it came with a caveat, it came with an asterisk of you're smart but you are awkward, you're a great fighter but you can't get the girl. And I think when you're younger, it's like you think about it in that simplistic term of like, oh, like girls don't want me. But as you get older, you're like, okay, like this is becoming really frustrating, because it's not even just about like dating and like just this typical boy shit, but there's a part of me that feels like something's like wrong with me, like there's something wrong with being Asian. And I grew up very deep, like deep into that self internalized racism. And I think being Filipino, there's added layers of the years of colonial mentality that have been sort of dripped down from my mom to my older siblings to me. And it wasn't until I became older that I started to understand that like I didn't feel this way just on accident, and the things that I was watching was making me feel that way and amplifying those things. And it was funny because the moment where I really started to feel like more in tune with that side of myself, and the moment where I started to even just question the idea of like what Asian representation could look like, was in college. And this was the time that the Korean wave, the Korean pop culture wave came, and it was funny because like my friends started like listening to K-pop earlier than me, but they were listening to like, Girls' Generation. And, I was like, okay, I'm not really into that. And I was still steeped into that toxic mentality. I was like, oh, this is like weird Asian stuff. But then I remember seeing like groups like Big Bang and 2PM, and I was like, oh, these guys like, they dress cool, they like chicken chicks and stuff like that. And so I was like, okay, well, like there's something interesting here, and that was when I started to really shift my mentality of like, oh, maybe the problem was that I've been looking at the wrong place for representation. Maybe the problem was that I was always looking at American media for that validation, but I didn't understand the legacy of racism of American media, and the fact that American media is this, serves as a huge tool of propaganda, whether it's propaganda for capitalism or propaganda for racism and white supremacy. And so, yeah, I think that was sort of like the leaf that changed for me. But I'm curious to know, like, how about for you, like when that, especially as someone who is also Korean, like, what was that like once you started to see the growth of like K-pop and K-dramas and like essentially, the shifting of South Korean culture being more mainstream and more like, palatable to white people in America?
Yeah. I think my journey is a lot more internal. Like you said, I internalized colonialism a lot. Um, and it took a long time for me to decolonize my mind, and my relationship with my mom and her husband and my younger sister from their marriage, the way that that evolved over time also influenced how willing I was or was not to engage in my Koreanness at all. And I think once I started to get to a healthier place in my relationship with the most immediate Koreans in my life, then I was able to start to have a healthier relationship with, okay, I should really dive into this. And I still feel like a lot of it is external, though. I feel like the reason why this year, finally, after well over 30 years, I'm well into my 30s, I have started to try to earnestly learn Korean by taking like actual lessons. Because I've tried in the past in various ways, and either learning on my own or having like kind of like a student tutor that I couldn't afford to pay, like things like that. I've tried, but this year I earnestly tried to start learning Korean because I feel like I finally am in a place where I am very comfortable with being Korean. And like I think that was a huge part for me. And it sounds like it also had a little bit, like the decolonizing part had a role in your life too. And so I think when Psy came out with Gangnam Style, which was 2012, I finally was like, oh God, maybe I should like learn some Korean, or like I should know a little bit about this. But I never got into K-pop or K-dramas myself, even though like my younger sister was into them and my mom was into K-dramas and stuff. And also K-pop is like manufactured for a younger generation. It's just like it's targeting the younger audience. So I was kind of like not in that target audience when it got really big in like the early 2010s, around that time. But I find it interesting because I wonder what it's doing to people. So that's my question here, is like, I'm not into K-pop. I'm not a person who researches K-pop or anything like that. But I find it fascinating that, you know, this genre has emerged, and it's successful because it totally borrows, or if not steals and appropriates and exploits, hip-hop culture. But also fuses like EDM, and is using like the same kind of Swedish songwriters that American bands have used. So there's very like global in a sense, but in the way it's created, but it's also reaching global audiences. And I really wonder about like United States American audiences and how those fans, who are very multiracial, are understanding K-pop, because it's such a one note, like very simple, I guess I want to say, genre, from what I understand. Like it's not super complex, and it's not really diving into a lot of social issues, although I do know there are popular artists who do that. But, you know, do you feel like what is your read on this? Do you think it's like influencing people in a more positive way? Is it helping to homogenize what it means to be East Asian, or is it helping to draw out some of the differences? What are your thoughts on K-pop? And again, I'm totally not a huge fan, so I don't know a lot of the nuances, but just as a general like phenomenon.
You know, it's interesting that you say that, because you know, I think the way that K-pop has really changed people's perceptions of, I mean, not just their idea of what it means to be Asian, and, you know, what a cool Asian is like, but there are just so many Asian Americans and Asians around the world who have really become so inspired by K-pop in a number of ways, both good and bad. And on one hand, it's like you have this huge increase of people who, you know, in my earlier years of college, in the most simplistic form of cool, I'm on TV, or specifically YouTube. I'm on YouTube, and I'm being represented in a way that's kind of cool, that's kind of refreshing. But then you start to peel back the layers, and you start to understand, oh, okay, well, there's like this issue of this industry. These people who look cool, but they're like being horribly mistreated. And then you want to go ahead and talk about the fact that the people who are actually featured within K-pop, there's a very narrow look that is required in order to be part of this industry. And you start to unpack like, okay, well, you know, great that you have these macho Asian dudes and these cool, badass, you know, Asian female artists. But what happens when you also compound that with the fact that there is a huge issue with colorism. There's a huge issue with appropriation. And so it's almost like you're giving them something really good, but then you're also adding these other elements that are actually a little bit more insidious that start to stay with people. And I know that, you know, my wife is big on internet culture and big on internet history. And one of the things that she has sort of talked about when it comes to K-pop, and we've sort of talked about and observed, is the way that Southeast Asians, Filipinos, Thais, are feeling pressure to start changing their face and to start obtaining surgery and to, you know, to try to lighten their skin, because you want to now, instead of chasing a white ideal beauty standard, the shift has gone to a specific type of Korean beauty standards that Korean people also are, you know, are critical about. And so it's complicating, you know. It's on one hand, it's like, great, we have all this music and we have all these instances of, like, you know, there's like legitimately great, you know, K-pop artists, people who are like non-problematic, but there are also a lot of them who are. And so it really is a mixed bag. And I think it just makes me think about the times when I used to pray about, like, man, I wish it was just better. I wish there was just, like, you know, we weren't shown as like the goofy, awkward Asian person. And it's almost a case of, like, you know, you really got to be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, seriously. Yeah, and I did look up to see, like, where are the K-pop fans, just because I'm really curious. And the number one country with the most K-pop fans on Twitter, at least, is Indonesia, followed by Japan, Philippines, South Korea, and then United States is 5. They're the 5th. There's a list of like 20 that I saw, and they're from all over the world. But yeah, you're right. Like, I do feel like it's exporting the same beauty standards that are extremely detrimental to Koreans, as well as, you know, it's reinforcing colorism, which we experience in all sorts of ways in our communities across the United States. And that look that you said is very, very narrow, of the like 12 people that might be in a K-pop band, which is troubling. But I also find it really interesting that there's a lot of gender bending going on, and there's like a lot of blurring of the gender lines. You know, a lot of the male K-pop artists will wear makeup, and I'm like, really, that's accepted from American fans. That's interesting. So I wonder, I know you're saying there's a lot of masculinity too, but like, there in the United States, as we're perceiving it, it might look more like a blurring of masculinity and femininity in some ways. So I don't know. I would love to see K-pop push more, I guess, for like a change in some of these standards that they hold themselves to. But you also mentioned, like, they are very constrained by the industry and the contracts they signed. So I don't know how much that would be, how well received those kinds of transgressions might be by the actual promoters and people who are like helping the artists make money. You know, there's a whole question of like what goes on in such a black box. Like, how much control does the artist have and input versus the other folks that are behind the scenes. So I don't know. I find it to be such an interesting phenomenon that, like, when I say I'm Korean and randomly people will be like, oh, I love K-pop. And I'm like, oh, that's different. You know, it used to be like, oh, I love kimchi. And now it's like something else that has a little more depth than just like something you'll eat. So I find it very, very interesting. And I wonder if it's going to fizzle out, if it's here to stay or what.
Yeah, you know, I think that's a great point because, you know, I remember um, prior to the K-pop wave, and I remember there was, you know, being on the internet in the 90s, 2000s as an Asian person was not a good, a good thing. And I just remember all constantly conversation was because at the time it's like, you know, even though there wasn't this huge wave of like K-pop, there was like, you know, like J-pop, Japanese pop was still around, and there, so like these cultures and groups were active at the time. They just didn't, you know, come to our shores, and so I remember being in different forums and conversations with different people, and you'd always hear these non-Asian people, specifically a lot of these white people, who would be like, "Oh, well, you know, look at these Asian artists. They're feminine. They're basically girls." And so there was a lot of homophobia. There was a lot of, you know, deeply problematic, you know, ideas of gender. And I think at the beginning of K-pop, of sort of the Korean wave coming to the United States, I definitely had that feeling of like, you know, that me trying to learn through that internalized toxic masculinity and that, you know, deep-seated internalized homophobia. It's like I had to realize like, oh shit, the problem wasn't these men and these people who were like dressing however they want to dress and putting eyeliner or whatever. The problem was that I was still holding on to these standards that were deeply fucked up. And so I'm actually really glad that you have a lot of these artists who are you know, expressing themselves, and being more open with their gender expression, and that it's becoming, you know, popularized, especially when it comes to Asian people, because, you know, for a lot of Asian folks, it's like something that you had to feel like you had to hide. But sort of staying on that subject of South Korean media, I want to actually dive into something else that was really popular, which is the viral sensation of a TV show, Squid Game. You know, I love this series. I wrote a brief review about it a few weeks ago, and I thought it was such a great film, or a great series, that criticized capitalism and the debt crisis in South Korea. I know there are a lot of people who took different lessons away from the series, but I'm curious to know, like, what themes, what ideas really, like, what stood out for you?
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to talk about Squid Game. I did a whole episode on it, and then after the episode, I was like, damn, I didn't even talk about the old man. I didn't even talk about the elites, and there's so much in it. And I saw you also saying, like, trying to say movie at the same time, because it does feel like a movie. It feels like it's the production quality, and like I think a lot of people binged it as if it was a movie too. But I loved Squid Games, and I think, unlike Parasite or Crazy Rich Asians, I feel like there's, well, Parasite had a lot of nuance, but in Squid Games, there's so many different characters, for one, like so many different main characters, that I'm like, oh, a lot of people around the world and people who are not Asian in the United States are watching this. Are they getting a better sense of how Asians look different from each other? Because that was one thing that was like I kept thinking about, like, these people are all Korean except for the one dude who was Pakistani, but and they look wildly different. And I'm hoping, because I do see media as like a humanizing force. I do think that media, whether it's books or TV or music, can help humanize those that are different from ourselves if you don't have much contact with them. So that's one thing I kept thinking. I'm like, I wonder if just people watching this are learning, like, oh yeah, okay, maybe not all Asians look alike, even though they're all Korean, not even like different nationalities. But yeah, capitalism for sure. The runaway capitalism and kind of the social inequality that you mentioned, also the debt crisis. I feel like one main theme from also Parasite is like Korea trying to model itself off of the prosperity of the United States or the West. And I'm not convinced this is the best way to live. you know, and I'm not saying I want to live in the rainforest without, you know, without internet or something like that. But I do think a simpler way of life where we're not focused on consumption of items or travel. That's like a whole thing. Like, I don't know what's going on with people and travel.
I agree.
Like, oh, I just want to travel. Okay. Sorry, I don't mean to go on a tangent. That also has a lot to do with, I think, cultural tourism. But anyway, you know, I think that there's different ways to live where we're not like polluting our own air and water and things that we eat that can be a lot more beneficial to us, but it would have to be a bit removed from this hypercapitalism system we live in. But I do like how the Squid Games is talking about like what is valuable, like what is life, right? Like what do we value in our life? Is it really just money? Are we just here to work and die? And it is critiquing a lot of the like individualistic aspect of things, or it asks us to critique it, right? So one of the things I'm wondering, I'm like, you know, a lot of people see themselves as one of the players in the game, as evidenced by people who dressed up as a Squid Game player for Halloween, perhaps. But, you know, how about, do we also admire or harbor some of the characteristics of the elites? Because we do, and you know, like I think that that's worth exploring too. Or like the front man, and one of the questions I have is like, how did people in the pink suits get there? How did the front man get there? You know, spoiler, Inho is like, he used to be a regular old person, and his brother's like, what the fuck happened to you? So what happened along those lines? You know, it's kind of like, how did these soldiers, the pink suits, fall in line? They were probably not these soldiers who just stood by and watched people and, you know, were complicit in these killings. But then there's, I think the biggest piece of Squid Game is, well, they signed a contract. Like, well, they opted in. Like all the players opted in and they're choosing this. And so it's like interesting to think of how we're watching this from like a player's perspective. And I think a lot of folks really are fascinated by Squid Game because, like me, I wanted to know who was operating this, where did it come from? But at the same time, it's like, oh, well, we also have those characteristics of elites. And we're like, well, you know, people who made this Halloween costume for me, and I mean, I'm complicit in this. Like I dressed up as a shark with my fiance and our dog. We were all a family of sharks, and I bought a onesie that is probably only going to be used like once a year, maybe. And I'm like, well, you know, the people who made this are probably in these like awful conditions. And I think a lot of folks who buy things for like one-time use are like, well, the people in those conditions, they chose to be in those conditions without looking at these like systemic issues of how does, like, what caused Korea's debt crisis. And part of it is all the borrowing that they've done from other countries. So it's very interesting. Like, what do you think about the connection between the way like we do or do not relate to players or the elites in the film, the show?
Oh, I love that because you know, I think what's so fascinating about Squid Game is that the massive success. I mean, you're talking about like even just on an age level. I mean, you're seeing from, you know, older folks who are obviously critiquing the movie and breaking it down, analyzing it, down to children who are like, you know, recreating the Squid Games in Roblox and in, you know, Minecraft and shit. And so it's like, you know, you're talking about the success of, as a piece of art, something that is able to convey a message in just a wide range. You can watch it in a very topical way that's just like, oh, here are just people trying out some challenges. It's almost like an obstacle course, you know, like kids can watch it in that perspective. But then as you go along and as you start to strip away from the individual aspects of like, oh, I'm like Ali, or I'm like, you know, player one. And you start to get into the questions of like, who who are these elites, and how did this game start, and whose fault is it that this happened this way, or that this person got into this position? And you were sort of talking about, like, how did the front man get there? How did the people in those pink suits get there? And I think it all boils back to an awareness that the game is being played, that there is a system going on, that there is a reason why things are the way that they are. Because oftentimes people are so fixated on the individual of, I gotta get mine, I gotta win, I'm in this shit, like I need to do whatever I can. And I think it all goes back to the conversation of the game that we're playing, and in the context of capitalism, it really is just a testament to the way that capitalism warps so many of our personalities, and so many of us who might have a good foundation of morals, and maybe even like a good set of desires of what we want to do with the world. And yet, because of these extreme conditions, we're forced into coming for each other's necks, not trying to attack the front man, not trying to, go for the people who are in red. And, it's intricate, because it's like you can, on one hand, it's like you understand the cruelty of the game, but then you also understand the dire situations that some of these characters are in, that are like, wow, like if I'm like millions of dollars in debt, like I could see falling for that dude in the subway who wanted to play, like, so like I can totally get that, and especially when you look at how debt is structured to be so predatory to people of color, people who are lower income. And like I said, it really is sad in that sense, that, it warps so many of us. But I think you really do make a good point that, it's interesting how some people are able to just watch it from purely the individual level of like, oh, that's me, that's my character. But I'm not sure if you saw, but like, there's like a huge reaction from a lot of conservative people who watch Squid Game, and they're like, actually, this isn't anti-capitalist. This is about snowflakes, or this is about this is about communism. And I think it's so funny because it really just shows like how many Americans don't know that, like, that's you too. The Squid Game, we have our own Squid Game.
Yeah. Exactly. I know. I'm like, okay, so there's Bezos, he's an elite. Like, you can like just put faces underneath those elite masks and you already know who it is. Yeah, I think it's so interesting also. Like, I think the underlying message is compassion and working together and having more of an egalitarian society is what wins. Yeah. Because that's what is rewarded throughout the game, and that is what we see, again, spoiler, at the end, who triumphs is somebody who's compassionate. And you still have like the old man kind of questioning at the very end, like, do you really believe in humanity? Like, are there good people out there? So it does become, even though it's like a little hidden, it is still kind of like a superhero, like good versus bad.
Yeah.
But I don't know how many people got that message that bad is like this super hierarchical structure, because it's so entertaining as just from the game perspective. Like, okay, who's going to win this game? Okay, and what are the player dynamics? And I do think for me, that's why I really liked it, is it's kind of critiquing like the reason why we have these problems is because we're so stratified. And the elites also are not all American.
Yeah.
You know, there's like a couple in there speaking, I think one is speaking in Mandarin and another has like a Japanese accent. So it's like, we're doing it to ourselves. It's not like, it's not purely from a Western colonial mentality.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's great observation, because I know that a lot of people who are, anti-racist often talked about like, oh, the elites, they're representing white supremacy. But like you said, the inclusion of those other characters, really does speak to the way that capitalism as a system, like it doesn't necessarily, only want to have white folks on its team. Like it benefits from everybody pitching into this corrupt system. And even just going into the, spoiler of the front man of who he was and the fact that he was, one of these people. But going on that like subject of, trying to build a more equitable society. My next topic is something that I've actually not engaged with as much, and that's actually veganism. Yes. Full disclosure, I'm not a vegan, but for the longest time I had been, sort of against it, in the sense of like I was critical of how inaccessible at least American commercialized versions of veganism can be, and the fact that like not all communities can have access to those products or quality produce. But over the last year or so, like my mentality has definitely changed, especially being on the foraging / Asian cuisine side of TikTok. Okay. And that's when I start to like really appreciate like the different ways that veganism can exist as a form of food sustainability just all over the world, and how veganism, looks very different outside of just, a Western framework. And as a basis for, community gardens and the fact that most of the problems that I had with veganism, again, really did stem mainly from that sort of Western capitalist version. However, I know that's not the only type of veganism. So I'm curious to actually hear your perspective and your take on veganism as it pertains to being a vehicle for like racial justice or sustainability.
Oh my gosh, for sure. I think they're so interconnected. So another reason I love Squid Game, which there's just a long list of reasons, is because there's one line and one little section where they're making the connection of oppression of people with the oppression of animals. So and I think, all oppression is interlinked. So whether it's racism, sexism, classism, they're all similar in the sense that there's an oppressive force and there's a power dynamic. And so it's the same thing with humans and animals. And there's questions of speciesism. So why do we let some animals sleep in our bed and other animals can't even turn around in their cages? They never see the light of day, things like that. And that's, connected to the way that we oppress people. So in Squid Game, towards the end, the winner's like, why are you doing this? Like, how could you? And Frontman is actually answering, well, you're our entertainment, and, you bet on horses and you're our horses. And again, there's that justification. It's, well, you chose to play, you had an out, you didn't have to. Y'all could have come together and said, we don't want to do this shit no more, which they did one time. And so it's like justification. Well, some animals deserve to be treated like this, and some animals deserve not to be treated like this. And so I think there's a similar thing that happens with people. And it's like, well, some people, they deserve to clean toilets and never advance. Or, some people, they deserve to just be treated differently. Whether we're thinking about like immigration also, like some people don't deserve to live in the United States even. And so, because we're like so much better than other places, air quotes. But like, it's same with animals. So some deserve to be grown for slaughter, and others deserve to live pampered, charmed lives, like the cat that you may see sleeping behind me, right? So it's I find it to be, from a fundamental like conceptual plane, veganism is like, I don't want to be part of this oppressive system. I don't want to be part of a system that exploits animals for their bodies. I don't think those bodies belong to me. I think I don't want to be part of a system like, even with dairy. Dairy is extremely harmful to the environment, just like the meat industry is harmful to the environment. I don't want to be part of a system where the workers who are slaughtering the cows or the pigs or chickens are under these horrible conditions. They're often undocumented folks. They sustain lots of injuries, whether in the meatpacking part or whether they're like working directly with the animals. So it's like on multiple levels, veganism jives better with my values, because there is a lot of racial injustice and gender injustice. And of course, class injustice. Okay, race, class, gender, those are the three things sociologists focus on a lot. All those injustices are embedded in the meat industry, as well as like dairy industry. So I mean, of course it's going to be, because it's a capitalistic endeavor, and capitalism will always have those three tenets in it. But yeah, I think for racial justice also, when we're thinking about where our meat is coming from, like the hog farms in like North Carolina, for example, the people that live around those hog farms that are, can't open their windows because the air is so awful from all the pig shit, essentially, that is just like in the air. It's being sprayed onto spinach, like it's being used for other agriculture. The people who are in those areas are often low income, not white. In North Carolina specifically, a lot of them are Black. And so it's not just people who are consuming the items that are products of the meat industry, is people who are adjacent in some way, whether it's physical or they're working in the industry, or the meat industry also accelerates climate change. So a lot of cows are raised in the rainforest, where they're just slashing and burning the rainforest, and then excuse me, cows are grazing there, and then they're slaughtered for like McDonald's. So there's a lot of excuse me, intricacies to the connections of injustices, not just for the animals, but for humans. And those connections I find to be pretty easy to make at this point in my life, but I know a lot of folks don't make those connections. And to your question about veganism and like how easy is it to do, it's I think there was definitely a time where it was a lot more difficult to have access to like a variety of foods. But if you wanted to eat rice and beans, we could have always just eaten rice and beans. Like, it's very easy to buy those things as people in the United States. But now there's like all sorts of foods that are like meat substitutes, or just vegan or vegetarian like options. But yeah, I also find it interesting when people say it's inaccessible. I'm like, well, if you look around the world, like a lot of the things I eat is like non-American or like ethnic foods. So it's like Vietnamese food or Indian food. And because a lot of their diet is already vegan, and like coming from countries who didn't traditionally have access to a lot of meat. And meat used to be just like a flavoring, and not like a huge, like 1/3 of your plate, especially not every day. And so, yeah, I can go on and on about veganism, but I do think that those connections are really important. And I like how with that one line in Squid Game, it like really spoke to me. I was like, oh, I love that you make the connection between the animals and people. Yeah.
I'm glad that you said that, because, I'll even admit, I've always known that, as somebody who is an advocate for, racial justice, and who's anti-capitalist, I know how horrible the meat industry is. Just even if you want to just talk about from a climate perspective, but then you want to go down into the layers of, how these organizations employ people and underpay them, and who they source their labor from, and how they're able to exploit them, and the fact that they're able to treat these animals and put them in these conditions, and how so many of it is just given the okie dokie by like everybody up and down the corporate chain, and so it's something that I almost feel like it's just this ticking time bomb. You know, I mean, even when it came to COVID, sort of exposing how a lot of these farms started to get these problems, and so I know this is something that I have to like work through on my own, because even when you were just talking about how like, well, there's in terms of accessibility, there's like plenty of cuisines and cultures that have been doing food. Like you're right, like there's so many Indian places that have like all vegan menus, and I think another big part of it that is sort of like I'm my own hypocrisy is colliding into, which is there is a big cultural and educational aspect that I think, especially in the United States, where I mean, you were talking about how this idea of, it wasn't always the case that we had a big old pile of meat on our plate and then like a little like sides of veggies, like a leaf of spinach, but like I think so much of it is also deeply rooted into sort of the fabric of food identity in America, and how so much of almost the American dream of what it means to be well fed is to have this feast, to have the big old turkey, the big old steak, and I think like I almost feel like a lot of Americans in particular, I'm pretty sure that like I have a bias. I mean, I'm Filipino, and we also eat a lot of meat, so there's probably that too. But especially in the United States, like I almost feel like there's this sense of, you can't take away my meat the same way you can't take away my guns. There's just like an aspect of it that's like deeply embedded in our sense of like my freedom to do this. It is my right to do this. Oof. And so yeah, I mean, I'm kind of cracking open my own head on this, but yeah, I think that's I think that's such an important point, and I'm sure that we could go on about veganism, but.
Well, that I will comment real quick is like meat is very much connected to masculinity too, and that's like so insidious, and so that guns and meat connection and freedom, like all of that for me, when I hear you say that, speaks to our ideals of masculinity in the United States. And yeah, it's a good point. But yeah, there's a lot to unpack, I think, with our eating habits. Like it's not enough to educate someone about a thing. It has to be like easy enough to change, and you have to be willing enough to change it into a habit. And culture makes it really hard to change like eating habits. But if it's accessible and it's easy enough, and you have a willingness and desire to do it, then it can be something you can change. But yeah, it doesn't have to happen overnight. It is something that I think people can do gradually, and just generally reducing their meat or dairy consumption, and it will make you feel better. Like if you just eat half of the amount of things you eat in terms of meat and dairy, you will probably notice a difference. If you're supplementing with healthy vegetables and fruits and things like that.
Yeah, and I definitely think that especially with just the issue of food insecurity, and the fact that so much of the way that we try to rely on feeding the folks who are struggling to get a meal every day, and how oftentimes our answer to that is to lean on, America's, commercialized food industry as a remedy, instead of saying like, hey, maybe we should like build community gardens and like farms and like actually develop fresh produce. But that's obviously that we can go into a minefield of this, but switching lanes a little bit, I actually wanted to go more into your experiences as a biracial person. And one of the things that you've noticed over the years is the shift in the census numbers of people who are identifying as multiracial. So what can you tell us about this demographic shift, and what's your sort of analysis on this change in how people are identifying?
Yeah, and this is not necessarily my own analysis, because there's a lot out there about it, but I do find it so interesting. So the Census 2020 data has shown that there's been more people identifying as more than one race. And so I'll quote from the Washington Post. It was 9 million in 2010 to 33.8 million today. Wow. So over 10 years, and that's 276% for those that can't do fast math in their head like me. And they were also saying, you know, people identifying as Black, white, for example, doubled from like 1.8 million in 2010 to 3.1 million in 2020. And the overall percentage of white population decreased by 8.6%. But when you expand the white population to also include people who checked off like white plus another race, the white population isn't actually decreasing since 2010. It's up almost 2%. And this is information coming from both NPR and Washington Post. So it's interesting to see that. And I do think there are some factors that are at play. One is the way people are experiencing the world is different. So if you think about the way Asian folks have experienced the pandemic in the United States, it's very different than probably other folks in terms of the racism and the vitriol that has been put upon East Asian looking folks. And so that may have also changed the way people see themselves. Like, oh, well, yeah, I've been trying to pass as white, but you know what? I am Asian and people look at me and that's how they see me. As well as same thing with being Black. If you're mixed Black and something else, and you're seeing this rise of BLM and social justice around racial justice around Black Lives Matter issues and cops killing citizens that are Black and brown, then you might be more likely to identify as mixed if before you were just identifying as Black or one other identity. So I think that that's part of it. And also I have a lot to say about like the ancestry.com and like the DNA tests and you know, listening to some of the analysis out there. People have been like doing these tests and being like, oh, I'm not just white, I'm also this other thing.
Yeah.
Because, and I'm like, ugh. So you've experienced your entire life as a white person, and now at like 28 years old, you get this test and you decide, oh no, because it tells you that you might have had some ancestors in this other area of the world, which I find the methodology to be very problematic, first of all. But then you're going to just change the way you racially identify. And I think there's a lot of like cachet and like something exciting and exotic in the United States about not being white, which is extremely problematic, especially if you're a person who does pass as white, and just like trying to tap in and claim that because you want to be different. And using that as like a pawn, like, oh, I'm going to claim that I'm mixed when it's convenient for me. And all the other times I'll pass as a monoracial person and experience life as a monoracial person. So I'm like, yeah, this is a problem. Like the way people are interpreting the census numbers is saying like, oh, we have so many more mixed babies that are coming up and identifying as mixed race. And it must be because people have been, you know, having interracial relationships. And I don't think that's what's happening. It's just way too drastic of a change from between 10 years. So yeah, I think it's interesting for us to consider like, what does mixedness mean? And I also don't want to be the mixed race police. Look, it happens in all communities, okay? Yeah. There's always a list of things that you want to police upon, and I have to catch myself from being like, Maya Rudolph, really? Like, you know, like I gotta catch myself from doing that kind of stuff too. But yeah, I don't know. What have you noticed about the way people identify or talk about being mixed? And do you have thoughts on the census changes?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I think you made such a great point when you said that you know, the way that the political and cultural climate and the just general conversation on race has changed in the United States, has shifted people's perspectives in terms of like how they can identify or how they can use their identity in different ways. And I think it speaks to a really interesting experience of people who are mixed race and people who are biracial. When my wife and I eventually have kids, we're going to have kids who are also mixed race. And so, it's something that I definitely think about, especially as somebody who is like, I'm pretty much 100% Filipino. And so I really wonder, like, wow, like, I wonder how, like, because our kids are going to be have a wildly different experience from me, have a wildly different experience from my wife. And so it's something that I like eternally think about. And I think, in looking at how, just that conversation of, white people are going to be the minority by like 2040, and like, there's always there's always that, like, we are all the same color type of Facebook post of like the vaguely mixed race person who like looks like every race, and like, oh, this is the future that like
right. Right.
And so it's interesting, like hearing you talk about this, because from my perspective, like, I grew up hearing a number of different takes, like from one take of like, oh, these mixed people, they're like, they're lucky because they can just like choose to be white, right. But it's so much more complicated, because it's not as if like, you're mixed and so it's like a split down the middle, you look half, or like sometimes it's genetics, mm-hmm. And so it's
and siblings can look wildly different from each other
too. Yeah. I mean, like, there are so many people who it's like you might have like an Asian mom and like a white dad, and then one kid looks Asian, one kid looks totally white, and so it's just it's a totally mixed bag. And I think another topic that is heavily impacted by these identities is dating for mixed people. As a biracial person, I'm sure you've received like a number of backhanded compliments and like subtle but also overt forms of racism, specifically from people who are either fetishizing your biracial identity or they're like minimizing it. And so how have your experiences been as someone who is Korean and Swedish? And what are some of the, sort of highs and lows of this experience?
Yeah, I think there's so many different ways to respond to this question. I think, like, first of all, I'm not a double minority racially, right? So I'm not like, because I am white as well as a person of color or identity of color, like, I think that's a very different experience than someone who might be both Black and Asian or something where they are a double minority, like a Kamala Harris type. But I find that dating, because you're trying to be intimate with somebody, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally, that it brings out a lot of the concerns of not being monoracial. And so for people who maybe haven't explored that part of their identity, I do think it might come out and be something that they are confronted with when they are dating a monoracial person. I find, like, if I'm white and Asian and I date somebody who is either white or is either Asian, that reflects upon like my identity too. Like, people will look at that and be like, oh, she's dating a white person, so she identifies as more white. And so I wonder, like, how that plays out and how other people think about it, because I often haven't dated a lot of white people in my most recent history, because there's been so much, it's like, I don't want to have to educate you and give you a baseline that racial justice is important. And I feel like it's going to be a lot easier to have like a common platform with somebody who is a person of color. But yeah, I do find it interesting, and I wonder how other mixed race folks, and I have talked to mixed race folks about it, but how they think about their partnering, if they consider the race of their partner as a reflection on their racial identity and how that plays out in their relationship. And those who I think during the pandemic were feeling very Asian and targeted because of their East Asian look, or feeling identifying with folks who were being attacked, may not have gotten a lot of support from their partner if they were not Asian, or if they just straight up did not interact or interrogate their racial understandings, or the way they conceptualize race and how it plays into their relationship. So I feel like, you know, the support that you do or don't get from your partner could be impacted by your same or different race. Of course, it's all like experience as well, but those values need to be there, that you're, for me anyway, that you're on board with this racial justice idea, that you're going to respect my identity and not tell me, oh, but you're white, oh, but you're Korean, and like full stop, that's it. You know, I'm both. So yeah, it's I find it to be an interesting twist on dating.
No, and I think it's interesting that you're you know, talking about this idea of like, if you are a mixed person, and if you date somebody who, like, if you're half white, half Asian, and you date someone Asian, people might think, oh, you're more in touch with their Asian side, or if you date the white person, you're more in touch with the white side. And I think it's really fascinating, because it really does, you know, go back into that idea, you know, in a conversation about the census, of how identities are such a complicated thing, because it's something that, like, literally you can just be like sitting down and like, today I'm going to start identifying as I'm going to stop saying that I'm Filipino, and I'm just going to say that I'm like Asian, you know, like there's varying ways of how we like try to interpret our own identities and how we try to communicate those identities. But Ginger, I'd love to be able to talk about all these topics so much more, but it's been amazing having you on the show. Unfortunately, our time is up. But before we head out, what are you working on these days, and where can the LLAG community find and support you?
Yeah, okay, LLAG community. So my podcast is called Sippin Tea with Dr. G, and you can find it on all the platforms, Spotify, Apple, Google, all the places. And that's my primary baby. It's very casual. I do about a pod a month, or an episode a month. My next episode is going to be on critical race theory, and it's controversy with the schools. I also have a collab ep coming up about Sandra Oh in the chair. And so, yeah, we talk about various things. You can find me on Sippin Tea with Dr. G. My older podcast you could also check out, where I talk about media representations too, is Squeezin Lemons, and that's still up on all the platforms.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Ginger, and thanks everybody for tuning in. Don't forget to follow Ginger on social media, subscribe to Sippin Tea with Dr. G, and we will see you all next week. Bye-bye.
Yes. Thanks so much.